just working on not falling down those stairs. So, good morning. I'm really happy to be here talking to you all about a problem that I think a lot of you are probably familiar with, but I'm really excited to discuss the solutions, and I may even leave a couple minutes at the end if you've got questions. Of course, there's also the Slido. So, this is the title of a talk, the very first talk that I ever gave in Berlin, actually, in 2011. And when I was asked to give a talk today, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back, see what's still true and what's still valid, and rehash this issue. And it's something I've been working on for a long time, and that's the issue of policing content in what I call the quasi-public sphere. And what I mean by that, of course, is online platforms, social media. So I'm going to start with the premise that, in general, our publics are constantly being privatized and commoditized. And this is true offline with things like Google's Sidewalk Labs, with the privatization of beaches and coastline all over the world, and even spaces like city parks in some parts of the world. But specifically online, the spaces that we think of as the town square, maybe, again, I know this audience is more aware of these things than most. But these online spaces that we think of as the town square, your Facebooks, your Twitters, et cetera, are actually more like shopping malls. You have some freedoms, but you have a limited set of rights. And those rights can be taken from you fundamentally at any time. And of course, these spaces are governed by both state and corporate actors through the process of content moderation. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, I'm just going to run through what that means. As you probably know, most of these major platforms that we're using, although this is changing, are based in the US, and they're governed by the First Amendment, of course, but also by CDA 230, or Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is right now a pretty controversial topic of discussion, at least in the US. And what this law says is basically that you, as a platform, are protected from liability for the speech that your users post, but at the same time, this also gives you the right, without liability, to moderate content as you see fit. So that's one thing. That basically means that Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or whoever can decide for the entire world what they can and cannot say. And so if they wanted tomorrow to ban you from posting cat pictures, they could. And then on the other side of that, you've got state actors, governments that are putting pressure on companies to censor certain topics. Right now, this week, we've seen a lot of journalists in Kashmir in India having their Twitter accounts taken down for things that they've said. Now, these requests came from the Indian government. Some of them were adhered to, some of them were not. Some of them may have been somehow valid in terms of the law, many were not. And companies are in some ways bound to these and in some ways not. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is that the entire practice of moderating content in these spaces is inconsistent, vague, and not always right. So how does it work? I think most of you know, but again, I like to give the whole overview, make sure we're all on the same page before we start talking about the problems and solutions. This is a still from a film that I worked on that came out last year. It's called The Cleaners. Has anyone seen it? Got like one or two? Okay, cool. Well, great. Go download it or go pay for it. It's fantastic. It's by these two German documentary filmmakers. And what they did was they went to the Philippines and they interviewed a bunch of people who'd worked as content moderators, mostly for Facebook, although that's not always explicit in the film. And these content moderators told them what it was like to look at this horrible stuff every single day. And so basically, imagine that you're this person who's gotten this pretty good job based on what else is available. You're not working for Facebook, you're actually working for another outsourcing company. And this is true for a lot of social networks, not just Facebook, of course. So you've got this job, and your job is basically to look all day at everything from graphic violence and first-person murder videos to child sexual abuse imagery to hate speech, etc. And you are tasked with deciding in every moment whether something is or is not against the rules. I'm going to say that I think that this system is entirely broken, this system of policing content in the quasi-public sphere. So again, how does it work? The basic premise is simple. You have a set of community standards. Community, now I want to interrogate that word a little bit too, because when we talk about community, we usually talk about things like this community. Maybe we're the Web3 Summit community, or the blockchain community, although that's many other communities as well, broken down. Perhaps it's your local space. But when we talk about it here, what is Facebook saying? They're saying that 2.2 billion, or whatever the number is today, people are a community. I don't know if you agree with that, but I certainly don't. So we talk about this community, and they've got this set of rules that govern what you can and cannot say. And over time, this set of rules has changed and evolved in many different ways. Now, when it first started, back in the day, back in the mid to early 2000s, the first decade of this century, a lot of companies didn't recognize their role in the governance of our speech. They started out, with this idea that these were going to be free spaces, more or less. At least that's how they put it. And a lot of them talked about freedom of speech. One funny anecdote that I'm working on a book on this subject right now, and a funny anecdote that I came across that I think I knew but I'd forgotten was that in 2008, a senator in the United States, Joseph Lieberman, had penned an open letter to Google demanding that Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO at the time, address the fact that YouTube was hosting all of these videos from Al-Qaeda. Now, of course, we know that terrorist content or extremist content, whatever you want to call it, shows up on these platforms all the time. But today, if you read the news, you know that there are demands to swiftly take it down, and in most cases that happens. But in 2008, do you know what Eric Schmidt's response was? He actually said that it was, unless the video contained graphic violence, depictions of graphic violence, then it was freedom of speech. He stood there and he defended Al-Qaeda's freedom of speech. Now, that might seem implausible at this point to many people, but that was the era back then where these companies were kind of negotiating in this space without much pressure from governments about what was appropriate or not. Now, I think maybe some of the women in the room know that there was also some restrictive rules from the very beginning. One of those was women's bodies, of course. Women are treated differently on these platforms than men. We can't show the top half of our bodies nude, but men can. And often the companies just say, oh, but that's the culture. We're basing this on the dominant culture, and so we have to put these rules into place. Now, obviously, those are two very different examples, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that the platforms had a choice. And over time, that choice has in some ways been taken away from them, both by governments and by public pressure. So the other thing is that, well, we've got this set of community standards that's upfront, that's often very transparent and very clear to the user of what's allowed and what's not allowed. We also know, and this is a slide, I forgot to put the credit on it, my apologies to The Guardian, but this is a slide from Facebook that was leaked in The Guardian's Facebook files that demonstrates how these things are actually adjudicated. Now, this is just one example of how they deal with credible violence. You can see these differences. I'm not going to read them. But the X's are things that would be taken down from Facebook, and the green checks are things that are acceptable. I think that example in the middle that starts with "to snap," I think that one's particularly interesting. And I think when you look at this and the way that these individuals who are working on these platforms have to look at, make these decisions every day based on information like this, you can see how this becomes a complex and inconsistent process. Now, just to interrogate this idea of community and community policing a little bit more, community policing is a term that, I'm sure it comes from a lot of different places, but I knew it growing up as referring to a particular thing, which is the act of partnering groups or individuals, particularly in urban areas, with law enforcement for the purpose of making a neighborhood or a community safer. I heard about this a lot growing up. There would be community police actions and community watch networks. But online, community policing is a different thing. It essentially incentivizes snitching. So you're asked to look at what other people are saying, look at what your friends are saying, and then snitch on them, essentially for the profit of a corporation. I know that might sound a little too pithy for some, but that's how I've seen it after looking at this for almost a decade now. And again, Facebook, or whatever platform we're talking about, with more than 2 billion users, how can you call that a community? And so what does that process look like? Of course, you're all familiar with this. You've all seen this. This one's even a meme at this point. But you're basically meant to click this thing, flagging tool, and report the other user for what they've done. You've got all these different options. The first one was from Facebook, the second one from Twitter. Again, I want to reiterate, I think that this system is fundamentally broken. There's a few reasons why. I've enumerated those, but so what else is there? So we've got the fact that we've got people who are forced to look at these images all day long, usually people in the global south who are being paid at times $1 a day. That's from a Reuters report about Facebook in India specifically. People who are being paid very, very little to look at images and screen them so that you don't have to see them. Then the next thing that we've got is increasing use of automation. Now, does anyone in the room think that that's a good idea to automate these processes? Ooh, wow, okay, I thought that I would see more of that. Okay, so a lot of people do think it's a good idea, and particularly the companies, because they've started to automate a lot of these processes. Now, we know that automation works pretty well for some things. It works pretty reasonably well for identifying naked bodies and porn. It works reasonably well for identifying things like flags. So if it's the ISIS flag, you can pretty easily say, oh, yep, that's that. We can hash that and put that in this database and then take it down universally. But it doesn't work so well for text. I don't know if anyone's seen Jigsaw's Perspective API. Love that thing. Basically, has anyone seen it? It's meant to basically judge the civility in comments, and they're encouraging newspapers and other online sites that do comments to use it. But what I've noticed is that if you say something really, really politely, like men are superior to women, it will judge it as very civil. And if you say, wow, this fucking party's great, it will judge it as completely not civil. So I know that's just one example, but text and automation don't work so well together. And so if we're trying to say, you know, oh, well, Twitter should just get rid of all of these people, they should just take care of this, take care of hate speech by using automated processes, it's not going to work so well. You need humans for that. But then on the flip side, if you have humans, you need humans to have to look at that. So this is quite a quandary. And what's the result of it? Now, I know some people don't like it when I talk about censorship as this, you know, because we're talking about private companies, right? These are companies, they have the right, as I said at the beginning, to make these decisions however they see fit. But censorship is not the First Amendment or Article 19 or whatever constitutional amendment from whatever country you're from. Censorship is the act of an authority making decisions about content and judging and censoring and filtering. And so what's the result here when an authority, like one of these platforms, makes these decisions? Well, you see things like this. You see Twitter suspending accounts critical of the Chinese regime. You see Facebook deleting political ads that criticize its platform. This one really gets to me. You see YouTube and Facebook removing evidence of war crimes, evidence that could be used in future tribunals, particularly when it comes to Syria and Ukraine. We've seen a lot of this happening. You see Facebook using automation to take down certain words, just like with the Perspective API, but in this case, that's a word that's maybe been reclaimed by a community, and we see this a lot in different languages as well. You see YouTube apologizing but defending the hosting of videos with homophobic slurs because it decides that this is not hate speech, but something else is. And so I think that we have to think about these things differently. First, I think that there's two different ways, let me just say that. On the one hand, I've been working, as some of you might know, toward incremental change for a long time on these platforms. And I do think that when we talk about this in rooms like this one, where people are quite technical, quite aware of the problem, quite privileged in some ways, we do have to recognize that, again, 2.2 billion users, a lot of those people aren't going to move to whatever other hot new network there is or decentralized platform. A lot of times there are barriers to entry for those people. And so I do think that it's important, at least for me, to work toward incremental change on these platforms. And to that end, we've been working with them to implement things like appeals processes for users, transparency in what they take down, whether it's because of a government request or because of their own rules, and other transparency around that, such as notice to users about exactly what they've done and how they violated the rules so that they can fully understand how to use the platform. But at the same time, I think that when I'm talking to a community like this, I want to challenge you to think about building another system entirely. And so I do think that there's another way forward for us. I think that we can maintain a free and open internet without relying on these centralized corporate systems. And I think that it's on us to start building our own communities and thinking about what that means more. So when you are building if you're building any kind of network, any kind of platform that would be hosting user-generated content, anything that's for the purpose of us connecting to each other, or as Mark Zuckerberg might say, making the world more free and open for all of us, think about how to really do that. Think about putting consent in first, and when I say consent, I mean forward consent for your users so that they know exactly what they're signing up to from the very beginning. If you want to ban hate speech, that's okay, but make sure that your users know that, and make sure that they're not just clicking a box, reading these lengthy terms and conditions, but having choice. And then there's the entire process of content moderation. I would also challenge anyone who's thinking about these issues not to centralize that process. If we want to really deal with some of these hard issues, we need to deal with them as our actual communities and not rely on a centralized system of policing to handle them for us. I've got 4 minutes left, but I think I'm going to end there. If anyone has a question, I'm more than happy to take it. Otherwise, it can send you off to, I think, a break early. So this is me. You're welcome to get in touch. That's my Twitter and my email. And thank you so much for listening. I'll be around for the rest of the day.